So now that we've examined the conducting zone structures, we can turn our attention to the respiratory zone. The respiratory zone represents the sites of gas exchange, that is between the air in the alveoli and the blood that is in the alveolar capillaries. So at the most distal parts of the bronchioles, the terminal bronchioles become respiratory bronchioles, the respiratory bronchioles become alveolar ducts, and the alveolar ducts lead to alveolar sacs, which are small clusters of alveoli. The alveoli are where gas exchange is going to occur. So perhaps not surprising, because this is where gas exchange occurs, we see that the alveoli are extremely well vascularized. Approximately 70% of the alveolar surface is covered in capillaries. So in addition, there are also millions of alveoli per lung. There's about 150 million alveoli per lung. Of course, this is size dependent. That means it depends on the size of each lung. So not only are they extremely well vascularized, but there's also many millions of them to help facilitate lots and lots of gas exchange. We see that the alveoli are not independent of one another, but they are connected to one another through these alveolar pores. And alveolar pores function to equalize the air pressure throughout the lung, and they also provide alternative routes for air if blockages happen to be present. The surface area, in addition to the number of alveoli, is quite large. We see that on average, the surface area of all the alveoli in the lungs is about 90 square meters, which is equivalent to about 960 to 970 square feet or so. There's, of course, a great range about this number because of the size of different individuals' lungs, and it can be as much as 140 square meters, which is roughly 1,500 square feet in size. So very impressive surface areas as well as numbers of alveoli to facilitate gas exchange. So we see that the respiratory membrane is the structure that exists between the blood in the alveolar capillaries and the air that is in the alveoli. So therefore it represents the barrier that respiratory gases have to cross in order to be exchanged. We see that it is composed of the walls of the alveoli as well as the walls of the capillaries that are surrounding those alveoli. It is extremely thin and has a high surface area. And as far as thinness goes, it's about 0.5 micrometers in diameter, which, if you recall, a red blood cell diameter was on average about 7 micrometers or so. So that means that it's about 14 times thinner than the diameter of an erythrocyte. So we see that 3 structures in total make up the respiratory membrane. All 3 of them are listed on the lower right side of this diagram here. We see that they are composed of the respiratory membrane is composed of the alveolar epithelium, the capillary endothelium, and the fused basement membranes that exist between them, which is a connective tissue and protein glue that holds the alveolar epithelium to the capillary endothelium. The alveolar epithelium is a simple squamous epithelium, so the bulk of this epithelium is composed of what are called type 1 alveolar cells, which function to give structure to the alveoli. These cells, as you recall, are flat cells and they're very thin, which makes them ideal for gas exchange. We see that the lung tissue is mostly composed of alveoli, in particular the type 1 alveolar cells as well as the alveolar capillaries. But between the alveoli are bundles of elastic connective tissue. And this elastic connective tissue makes the lungs stretchy, and the alveoli themselves make the lungs kind of porous and spongy. We also see that the alveoli are composed of small populations of what are called type 2 alveolar cells. These are not as common as the type 1 alveolar cells because the type 2 alveolar cells have a different function. They function to secrete a substance called surfactant, and surfactant is a detergent-like compound that helps to reduce the surface tension of water in the alveoli, which helps to keep the alveoli inflated. So we see that there are microscopic coatings of water, very thin coatings of water on the surfaces, the inner surfaces of the alveoli, and the production of surfactant by type 2 alveolar cells helps to reduce the surface tension of the water that is in the alveoli, so that way it helps to keep the alveoli inflated. If the surface tension is too high, that is, if there's too low surfactant being produced or too little surfactant being produced, the surface tension of the water in the alveoli would actually tend to kind of pull the alveoli closed instead of helping to keep them open. So the surfactant is necessary to help keep the alveoli inflated, or at least make it much easier for the lungs to inflate the alveoli with each breath. We see that deep breathing stretches the alveoli, and it also stimulates the type 2 alveolar cells to produce additional surfactant. So this, again, helps keep that surface tension of the water in the alveoli very low. And finally, the last cell type that we see in the alveoli are alveolar macrophages, and these help to destroy bacteria and break down debris and dust and things like that that make their way into the alveoli and get trapped on the alveoli surfaces. So this helps to keep the surface of the alveoli sterile and clean.